Welcome, everybody, to tonight's author talk about the legends of Sleepy Hollow. I'm very glad to see you all here with us, and I want to let you know that I'm muting you as you join the call, but you will be able to unmute yourself to ask a question, but please wait till the end of the talk to do so. You can also, though, put questions in the chat box, and I'll monitor those and we'll pose them to the speaker at the end. Also, Milton Access Cable is filming this program, and I want to thank the Friends of the Milton Public Library for their support of my events. Now, let me tell you more about our presenter. Christopher Rondina is an author and folklorist with a passion for tales of ghosts, witches, vampires, and all the creatures of the unknown. Mr. Rondina's research can be seen in documentaries, including Night Visitors for the Travel Channel, The Tillinghast Nightmare for Firesight Films, and the regional Emmy-nominated PBS film Ghosts and Vampire Legends of New England. He's the author of multiple books about haunted stories, including the one he will be telling us about tonight called Legends of Sleepy Hollow, The Lost History of the Headless Horseman, and has written another book called Vampires of New England, plus many more. Chris's research has been featured on television, on radio, and in print for many years, to include also programs for the Discovery Network. Please join me in a warm welcome for Chris.
Well, hello, everybody. Very happy to be here tonight. All right, so let's get started then. Hopefully we've got a few people in here, and I'm going to bring some visuals up. And of course, always happy to listen to questions, or if you want to come up with any questions, of course, we'll talk about it a few minutes at the end. But I'm going to assume right off the bat here that most of us folks are familiar to some degree with the legend of Sleepy Hollow. I do feel like in some way we all know the story. Legend of Sleepy Hollow is in many ways the first great American ghost story. And if you have not read the original, I feel like if you're watching the program tonight, you've at least seen some of the various filmed versions over the years, some of which are authentic or faithful to the story, and some of which divert from it pretty significantly. But the basics, which I think most people are familiar with, is it's the story of Ichabod Crane, who is an awkward, sort of socially climbing country schoolmaster who comes to a little village of Sleepy Hollow from Connecticut to become the local master of their schoolhouse. It's about Katrina Van Tassel, a beautiful young 16-year-old girl who is the heiress to a fairly significant farming piece of land and probably the best fortune in town. And last but not least, the town bully / hero, a kind of a burly, they call him a burly roistering blade by the name of Brom Bones, or Abraham Van Brunt, which is his given name, but everyone in town calls him Brom Bones. Now, this is a sort of a love triangle, but it's a love triangle with a fourth member in it, because if you're, of course, at all familiar with the legend of Sleepy Hollow, you know the fourth member of the love triangle is the Headless Horseman. Now, the thing about Ichabod Crane is that Ichabod Crane is wildly superstitious, and he's the sort of person who loves ghost stories. He loves stories of witches and ghosts and phantoms and monsters, and he is familiar with all the old witchcraft legends throughout New England, and he loves ghost stories more than anything else. And so Ichabod Crane spends most of his evenings when he's not at the schoolhouse listening to the old Dutch wives, because Sleepy Hollow was primarily settled by the old German Dutch, listening to stories of all the different local legends. And so one of the stories that he hears most about is the legend of the Headless Horseman, which in many ways was Washington Irving, the author of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow's greatest work. Now, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was first published in 1820, just a little over 200 years ago, and it really is Washington Irving's masterwork. He actually wrote it in 1819 while he was living in England, but he was very homesick for his life in America at that time, and so he was writing a lot of stories about his reminiscence in the Hudson River Valley. including the story that would become the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which was ultimately published in 1820 in a collection called the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. And it was a variety of different essays, fictional stories, and all of his reminiscences of his life. And it was a delightful book. It's a travelogue, it's a social comedy, and it was very much a homesick love letter to his life in post-revolutionary America. Now, one of the primary stories in it that became very famous was Rip Van Winkle, which is again a story that's very much about folktale. However, the most standout story of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow of the sketchbook is the Legend of Sleepy Hollow itself. And what Ichabod Crane hears is the story of the dominant spirit that haunts the enchanted region and seems to be commander in chief of all the powers of the air, the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It's said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. The body of the trooper having been buried in the local churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and the specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Now, this is absolutely the first great ghost story in American history. In fact, many people say that Washington or refer to Washington Irving as the sorry about that. I jumped back in here as the first great man of letters in America. In fact, he was the first American writer who was respected by the British, who actually the British would read his work, which is remarkable considering the fact that the Revolutionary War was barely gone at that time. And so the tensions between America and the British were still fairly high at that time. So he was one of the real icebreakers who kind of started to bridge the gap between the culture of Great Britain at that time and the culture of our very young country, America. But Washington Irving was also kind of he was kind of a not a ne'er-do-well precisely, but he was an unfocused person. He went to school for law, but never really became much of a lawyer, and he ended up being sent to England by his family to manage the family business over there, largely because they had no one else to do it. But while he was there, he collected folklore and he became sort of a more accomplished writer, and that was when he began to mail his stories slowly but surely back to the U.S. to be published. But a lot of what Washington Irving wrote about were stories that he had heard in his youth. Washington Irving first came to the Sleepy Hollow area, which is a little bit north of New York, just outside the village of Tarrytown. He first came there in 1798 when he was only 15 years old. And at that time, he was trying to escape the yellow fever. His family sent him to New York or to the Hudson River Valley to escape the yellow fever that was just ravaging New York at that time. So he got to spend a lot of his formative youth wandering on the shoreline, wandering through the woods there, and of course, doing very much what Ichabod Crane loved so much to do, listening to the stories told by the old timers. And that was where so much of the legends that he loved came from. So where did Mr. Irving get the idea for his headless phantom? Folk tales told by his Irish nanny, local Dutch legends, the real history from Sleepy Hollow. Very certain to say that all of these contributed to not only the legend of Sleepy Hollow, but a lot of Washington Irving's writings. However, there was plenty of old folklore that came from his heritage and things that he had probably read about as in his youth as well that contributed to it. Now, folklore is absolutely chock full of stories of headless ghosts. Headless ghosts show up in Harry Potter. They show up in all sorts of folklore and fiction all over the world. It's a very popular trope. But there were some particular headless ghosts that he probably would have been aware of. One of them comes from the Brothers Grimm. German folklore records the story of a ghost called Hans Jägenteufel. Now that's a great name, and it actually literally means Hans the Hunting Devil. And this was a man who in life had been sort of not a criminal precisely, but someone who lived a lackadaisical life, never accomplished anything, and eventually fell afoul of the law. And they say in old folklore that if someone dies a criminal that should have had their head chopped off in life, if they die without confessing their sins or they die without making up for their sins, that in the afterlife, they will be forced to wander headless, basically living out the penance that they should have experienced in life. So Hans Jägenteufel was just such a man. He was this man who was basically dreadful. He was a gambler. He was a drinker. So after death, he had to redeem himself by wandering around as this headless spirit. But his job as a headless spirit was to go and actually sort of reclaim lost souls or other souls who are falling onto the path of evil. Another piece of folklore that would have been known to him would have been the Irish story of the Coach-a-Bower. The Coach-a-Bower was the death coach, basically the Grim Reaper in Irish folklore. And this one is interesting because the Coach-a-Bower was driven by a headless spirit, but in some versions of the story, this coach and four was also pulled by horses without heads. So it's a very, very ghostly vision, and people on the verge of death would see the Coach-a-Bower coming for them to take them away to the afterlife. So these are both fairly grim stories about headless spirits, both of whom would come to claim you sometime, in your last moments of life. And so they were disturbing stories, but I'm sure very fascinating. But these were probably only a portion of what led to the creation of the Headless Horseman. Probably the most specific influence would have come from a very dark and very frightening Irish spirit known as the Dullahan. Now, the Dullahan is a spirit who is meant to be, the Dullahan means the Dark Rider, and this one is again a death spirit. He's specifically a Grim Reaper type. The Grim Reaper who would come and collect your soul, but could also cause your death. The Grim Reaper, or rather the Dullahan, would ride through the night, carrying his head under his arm or on the pommel of his saddle, and the head glowed with this dark sort of spirit or spectral light, with light shining forth from the eyes and light shining forth from the mouth. And anything the rays of the skull touched was doomed to die. So he was not only a soul collector, but he was a death bringer. And one of the most gruesome features of the Dullahan is that he carried a whip made from a human spine. So this is a very, very dark concept, but also one in which we can see the sort of basic concept of the Headless Horseman in his nascent form. So all of this folklore contributed, I think, to the stories, because very much the stories that Washington Irving would tell were evolutions of older folk tales that he brought into a modern context. But people are frequently asking, is there any truth to the story of the Headless Horseman? Is the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow based on anything real from the Hollow's history? And that's a fascinating question, but it's one that actually does have a surprising answer, because yes, there is some very real history behind the legend of the Headless Horseman that comes directly from the Hollow. And whether this is coincidence or fate, I couldn't tell you for sure. But I can tell you that the Battle of White Plains took place on October 28th of 1776. And this was the last great action of the Hudson campaign. General Washington, George Washington, long before he had become president, was at the command of these forces, and they had been pushed back time and time again. The British were winning. The British were driving us out of Manhattan, across the Hudson River, up into the Highlands, and the Battle of White Plains was an absolutely dreadful defeat for the American forces. In fact, by the end of the day on October 28th of 1776, the American forces led by General Washington were doing their best to retreat, but they found themselves in a difficult position, because with British forces seriously outnumbering them and having soundly defeated them, they couldn't just turn tail and run. They'd have basically opened themselves up to British attack. So they would pull back and they would pull back, they'd entrench and they'd pull back again. So the aftershocks of the Battle of White Plains lasted for several days. And by the evening of October 30th, they had entrenched themselves just a little bit north of White Plains in a town called North Castle. And North Castle is basically a suburb of White Plains. They were still looking to escape, but at this point, they were just hunkering down and hoping to hold off the British long enough to actually have an opportunity to flee the site. The British were about to take advantage of this, and they had decided that they were going to attack the American line on the night of October 31st. Ironically, Halloween, of course, but the weather was dreadful that night. It was driving rain, a torrential storm, and a battle became impossible. And so they ended up holding off and not choosing to attack until the following morning. Now, when they came out the following morning, they found that the Americans during the night had pulled back yet again to an even more defensible position. And this was at Miller Hill, just in the hills just north of White Plains. Miller Hill was a highly defensible position, and now the Americans looked like they had a pretty good setup. They just needed the right opportunity to flee, but the British were still going to move on them. So in the early morning hours, just after dawn of November 1st, 1776, the British forces attempted to take Miller Hill and to take out the American forces there. But when they got to Miller Hill, they found that the Americans were better prepared than they expected them to be. And we know the details of this battle specifically because of the memoirs of one of the generals present. His name was Major General William Heath, and he was one of Washington's most important generals during the New York campaign. General Heath specifically recounts the British movements leading up to this, and he recounts a really specific moment in the battle, which is fascinating, and it's the one that concerns us tonight. After the British attempted to take the American position, they had with them Hessian soldiers, and we're going to discuss them in just a moment. But he recounts that the British approached the position, and here unknown to them were some 12-pounders, meaning cannons. This was a small caliber of cannon, and upon discharge of which they made off with their field pieces as fast as their horses could draw them. But this is where it gets fascinating. A shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of Hessian artillerymen, and they also left one of the artillery horses dead on the field. What other losses they sustained that day was not known. Now, this is intriguing specifically because we have the Hessian soldier, we have the head taken off by a cannonball, we even have a horse laying dead on the field. It's basically a perfect setup for the genesis of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, but it almost perfectly mirrors even the way Washington Irving wrote about it. It's said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. And people sometimes like to point out when this is brought up that it's not a nameless battle. The Battle of White Plains is quite famous, but this isn't the Battle of White Plains. The Battle of White Plains was on the 28th. This was when aftershock. It was days after the battle. And in any account of the Battle of White Plains, it's never mentioned because this is considered to be an insignificant skirmish. It only lasted a few minutes, and it doesn't have any major point in history, except for the death of this one Hessian. And what I've always found fascinating about it is that General Heath mentions it at all, because what a general's job is to maintain an entire detachment of men. This is a man who had hundreds, potentially thousands of men under his command, and the death of a single enemy soldier isn't something that would have normally made much of an impact unless it was a spectacular sight to see. You have to imagine that the vision of this happening must have been a shocking sight indeed, enough to actually encourage him to mention this and to put it in his memoirs. So it's a fascinating survival. And then what you have to imagine is how this survived. But first, I do want to talk about who Hessians were, and as I promised that I would. So the Hessians were German soldiers, and these were, they're often referred to as mercenary soldiers, and in most versions of the legend of Sleepy Hollow that have been made into film or whatever, people tend to take that the wrong way. They assume that the Hessian soldiers were people who were who were there for money, who were basically cashing in on other people's misery, but that's not at all the case. The Hessian soldiers that were present during the American Revolution had been hired by the British, but it was the princes back in Germany, in Hesse, the central region of Germany at that time, because at that time Germany was basically made up of a whole bunch of smaller principalities, and each of the princes there always vying for power. But the princes had men under their command, and they would rent them out. But the soldiers did not make a nickel more than their ordinary pay. These soldiers were not being well paid to be there. In fact, their conditions were not even all that great. They'd been sent across the ocean to fight in foreign battles that they had nothing to do with, and they were getting their ordinary average pay. And conditions could be absolutely dreadful. Because of this, it's worth noting that in the aftermath, and even during the time of the American Revolution, a lot of Hessians ended up defecting to the American side because we were able to promise them land and a good life here if we won the war. So a lot of Hessian soldiers actually stayed behind, and many of their descendants exist here to this day. But the Hessians were known for being incredibly fierce in battle. So fierce, in fact, that they were seen as virtually inhuman by the American people, because when they would come through, they were precise, they were regimented, and they were absolutely brutal. So they had a monstrous reputation. So in a way, it was an excellent setup for a monstrous story. So the idea of a Hessian decapitated by a cannonball in the sight of everyone was not only a shocking sight, but it was an excellent starting point for a ghost story. So when I discovered all of this, just to be a little bit of backstory here, I had already begun to work on a version of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I wanted to print an edition of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow that contained all of the whole folklore and all the history surrounding it. And discovering that this Hessian had existed and maybe was a real man was fascinating. And of course, I thought that it would be a good idea to find out who he was. So I went to every scholar, everyone who was an expert in the topic of Washington Irving's writings, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, assuming that somebody would know who this Hessian was, only to find out that nobody did, that small entry in Heath's journal referring to the decapitated Hessian was the only record in America of his existence. And I really couldn't let that stand. I felt that I couldn't publish this book in good conscience without learning more about this headless Hessian. So the question of who was the forgotten headless Hessian really ended up preying on me. So I did a little bit of research, and I actually had a wonderful historian who was assisting me who told me that what I needed to find were the German muster rolls, the muster rolls basically being the troop lists. And I thought that someone here in America might have copies of them. And unfortunately, every avenue that I took ended up being a dead end until I was not able to determine anything here in the States. But I did end up finding through the course of my research that a cache of Hessian documents would most likely to be found not in the States, but all the way in Germany, in Marburg. Marburg is the absolute heart of Hessian Germany, and it is the site of the largest archive of Hessian records and materials in the world. And I'm not going to lie, at that point, I thought that was the end of my road because I thought I'm not going to travel to Germany just to find a couple of pieces of paper. And I figured I wouldn't have much of a chance of doing it. But I also decided that if you don't try, you never get anywhere in life. And so I decided that I would give it a shot. And ultimately, I ended up booking a ticket and did fly to Marburg and went to the Hessian archives there. Now, mind you, my German is not excellent by any means, but like a lot of Americans, I made the somewhat foolish assumption that everybody or most of the people I met would speak English. That did not turn out to be the case, and I had to do a lot of pantomiming and a lot of translating on my phone while I was in Marburg. But I did get there. I reached the archive and was presented with a folio of papers. And that folio of papers was, okay, actually, I'm sorry, jumped ahead a little bit here. So my search focused, of course, on the muster rolls. I was specifically looking for several Hessian regiments present at the Miller Hill battle, most notably the regiments of Lossberg, Kniphausen, and Rahl. So I had the archive put these aside for me, and I was presented with these documents and immediately realized that I might be in over my head. If any of you are looking at this and thinking, how on earth could anybody read this? That was exactly my experience. So these are real photographs of the actual documents with their wax seals intact. These are handwritten 250 years ago. And this was what I was confronted with. And I stared at these documents sitting in this archive building and immediately assumed that I had failed because I couldn't make heads or tails of what I was looking at. To say that that was disheartening was an understatement. But I couldn't simply go home with my tail between my legs. I'd flown halfway across the world. So I took out my phone and I took as many careful photographs of the documents as I possibly could. And I basically in quadrants, because the pieces of paper were not small. These are not normal size copy paper. These were about 18 to 20 inches in length, enormous pieces of paper, all handwritten. So I took photos in quadrants to get everything in great detail and figured when I got home, I could pour through them carefully and do my best to try to find something of use there. Now, the archivist did not speak a word of English, but with a little bit of effort and some translation through my phone, I was able to request that he scan some of these documents, and he agreed to do it. And fortunately for me, he actually did it immediately, not while I was at the archive, but he did it that same day. So later that evening, I received an email, and it actually had the scans of the documents, which were much clearer than anything that I could take on the phone. So I spent the next few nights in my hotel staring at these documents fairly helplessly and feeling again that I had nothing, that there was nothing in here that made any sense to me. The writing was so tiny and crabbed and faded after centuries that I couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. So I definitely was feeling a little bit on the low side. But the back sides of the documents were a little bit less dense and a little bit easier to read. And that was when, oh, lost, there we go. That was when I realized that on the document of the muster rolls of the Regiment von Rahl, by the way, Johann Gottlieb von Rahl was one of the major forces during the American Revolution. In fact, I would imagine that most of you are familiar with the story of George Washington on Christmas Eve and his men crossing the Delaware to attack a Hessian camp in Trenton, New Jersey. That camp was the camp of Johann Gottlieb Rahl. He was one of the most significant figures of the Hessian forces here in America, and he ended up being killed that day at Trenton. But before that, he was at White Plains, and his forces were a Grenadier regiment who had stormed that American position. So on General Rahl's documents, I found something that was a little bit easier to understand, at least a little bit. I realized that these were legible names. It was a list of names, but I didn't have any idea what their significance was. There was one word, however, right at the top of the page that did stand out to me, and that word was Totgeschossen. I apologize on the screen, you can't see it all that clearly here, but Totgeschossen, I knew the German word for tot, T-O-D-T, meant dead. A student that was at the hotel that I met ended up helping me clear up the full word, and the full word, Totgeschossen, literally meant shot dead. And I realized I was onto something because I knew now that I had the casualty lists. And the casualty lists were the thing that I needed most. So looking at this casualty list, I found two entries that had to be important. Both of them were two men, and both of them indicated on the far side, if you look at the right side of the screen, the word Withplane, W-I-T-H-P-L-A-I-N-E. There was no way that was a coincidence. I knew that Withplane had to mean White Plains. And so the only day in the month of November that these men were at White Plains was the 1st. They immediately left after that. There were no other battles. So on the 1st of November, both of these men, Heinrich Range of Milsungen and Wilhelm Gossmann of, gosh, I'm not even sure I can say what the name of that town is, but both of these men died on November 1st at White Plains. I knew here that I was on the verge of something important. However, I had a couple of issues. The first was I didn't know what the ranks of these men were, and I needed to know that just for informational sake. But also, if I had gone all the way to Germany and I could only narrow down the search for the Headless Horseman to two different people and had no way to distinguish between them, that would have been an unforgivable failure. I needed to find a way to determine which of these men were the decapitated Hessian. So I spent time with these documents, and I noticed one very important piece of information. The second name, the one towards the bottom of the screen, Wilhelm Gossmann. Wilhelm Gossmann, oh, by the way, you should definitely back up for just a moment and refer again to what General Heath said. General Heath said, a shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. So I looked at these two men, and I looked at this young man named Wilhelm Gossmann. Now, at first, I didn't know what he was. The picture is giving away the story a little too fast here, but when I looked closely at the listing, I saw there was a name, there was a word in front of his name, T-A-M-B, Tamb. And I didn't know what that meant, but it did sound familiar, and my first impression was tambourine. And I thought, well, I know he's not the core tambourine man, but I thought that could indicate that he was the core drummer. And with a little further research, in fact, timbre was the word for drummer that they would have used, I realized exactly who he was. Drummers were generally non-combatant soldiers. These were younger men. Drummers were used to keep the time for marching beats. They could even use different rhythms to communicate in between regiments. So they were very important, but they were non-combat soldiers. And the rules of war would have suggested that you don't target a drummer. These, again, are soldiers that, according to the basics of honor in war, are not combatants. The other soldier was named Heinrich Range, and Heinrich Range's range, his rank was a little bit more difficult to understand. There was a word that I was never able to translate that I assume was a specific reference to his rank, and I couldn't figure out what it was. But there was a piece of information that was helpful, and that was the company he was with. He was with a company called the Lieb Company. And I had already knew through my research that the Lieb Company were elite fighters. These were men who were incredibly skilled in battle. They were generally placed as the guardsmen to nobility, to royalty, to officers, and so these were the elite fighting force of any battalion. Heinrich Ranke was a grenadier. These soldiers used grenades. They would have a satchel with clay grenades with a little tiny fuse in them, basically looking like a bomb in an old Acme, Roadrunner cartoon. And they would light them and they would fling these flaming missiles into a group of enemies and take out multiple ones at a time. They were burly, they were strong, and they were the elite. And I realized that I had my answer, whether I realized it or not, because the one thing that Captain William or that Major William Heath would not have done is referred to a drummer as an artilleryman, especially not over a combat soldier. Every soldier has a degree of pride in what they do, and as a matter of pride, there's no way he would have made such a reference. He would have specifically noted that the dead soldier was a drummer. And it would have been easy to understand because if we back up for just a moment, we take a look at Wilhelm Gostman, look at the uniform. The uniforms were designed to be distinctive. Again, the rules of war would have said that you would not target these men, and they needed them to be visible because they were non-combatant soldiers. So the chevrons on the sleeves, the very distinctive livery, was meant to make them stand out. And there was no way that he could have made a mistake like that. So the only two that died that day were the grenadier and the drummer. And if the drummer would never have been referred to as an artilleryman, the one thing that I knew was that Heinrich Ranke was decapitated by a cannonball on November 1st of 1776. And that made Heinrich Ranke the Headless Horseman. Now, killed on November 1st, 1776 is particularly important because that is a day known as All Hallows. Now, of course, you're all familiar with Halloween, just passed a couple of weeks ago, and in a way, this is kind of our little Halloween aftershock here. But Halloween is an abbreviation of All Hallows Eve. And like Christmas Eve, Halloween is not the holiday itself or the observance itself. It's the doorway into it. Halloween is the night that leads us to Halloween. And that's important because Halloween, in the belief of a lot of older cultures, they didn't all call it Halloween, but All Hallows Eve was the night when people believed that the land of the living and the land of the dead would begin to overlap, and that the veil that separated the two was at its thinnest. And that meant that ghosts could pass back and forth between the land of the living and the land of the dead. So whether or not anyone at that time would have thought of such a thing, the idea that this soldier died on All Hallows, the Day of the Dead, effectively on Halloween, was a remarkable coincidence, if nothing else, and certainly the perfect birthday for the Headless Horseman. Now, the shocking story of this headless Hessian certainly would have made it around. It would have been shared as a fireside tale. Veterans of these kind of events, this is one of the ways that old war veterans earned their keep. Often they stayed in taverns, they told their stories, people bought them beers, people bought them food. This is a thing that was a common form of entertainment. Basically, they became bards, they became balladeers, and they would tell the stories of their time in the war. And like any good storyteller, they would elaborate and they would bring sort of flourishes into their story. So you can imagine how shocking already the story would have been to talk about being there on the battlefield and watching a Hessian soldier's head disappear as a cannonball carries it away. But how much more shocking would it be when he claimed that the Hessian then rose every night from the graveyard and would leave looking for his lost head. So now this ghostly Hessian would have found a horse, the ghost of a horse, presumably right there on the field beside him, perfectly mount up on his horse and flee the graveyard and go out in search of his head every night. This was literally the birth of the Headless Horseman. Now, people all, of course, always refer to him as the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. And that may seem a little mysterious because he clearly did not die at Sleepy Hollow. He died in White Plains, New York, or just north of it in the village of White Castle. But White Castle, I'm sorry, I keep saying that. It must mean that I'm hungry. North Castle. So North Castle, New York is about 6.5 miles from Sleepy Hollow. That's not very far at all. And in fact, the road between Sleepy Hollow and North Castle is nearly a direct line. So people often ask, how did the Headless Horseman become the Horseman of Sleepy Hollow instead of the Horseman of North Castle? And the answer to that is actually simpler than you may think. Of course, it specifically does indicate that he is buried at the old Dutch church in Sleepy Hollow. It says right there in the story, the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth each night to the scene of battle. Not a terribly long distance. In fact, a mounted soldier could make it from the church in Sleepy Hollow to North Castle in about half an hour, 45 minutes at a good gallop. And this is a ghostly steed, so I would imagine he'd be a bit faster than that. But why would they take the soldier all the way to Sleepy Hollow to bury him? And the answer is simple enough. This is a very long time ago, and it wasn't the world that it is today. Churches were not on every block, and if they had gone into White Plains, they probably could have found a church to bury the soldier, but the church was still, but White Plains was still completely overrun with the British. If this soldier fell on the area of the American side of the battle, he would have ultimately been collected by the locals there. Remember that when the troops try to flee that area, they are not able to go out into the field and collect their dead. They'd be exposing themselves to fire. So the troops would turn around and eventually they would make their way out of there. And that's what the American troops did. The American troops turned finally and were able to flee north under protection of their own cannons, flee north and head up to Poughkeepsie. And that would leave the locals, when everything had settled down, to go and collect the dead. But why would the American locals have collected the body of a foreign soldier? That's something that I had kind of stuck in my craw for a while. But I think in a way they didn't, at least not knowingly. Here we have Washington's Continental Army, 1776. And take a look at those uniforms just for a moment or two, and then we're going to play a little game. And that game is Hessian or American. And I'd like to know how many of you think that you could identify a headless soldier. Take a look at these uniforms now and think about a few moments ago when you took a look at the American uniforms, and tell me on a battlefield how similar these are or how dissimilar, and if you can identify a Hessian or an American. I would say that most people probably couldn't easily do it, especially, and you'll forgive me for this, but especially covered in the gore of an engagement. A headless soldier, I am sure that this was not a clean uniform. And so laying there on the battlefield with his blue coat and his red lapels, it would have been very, very easy to mistake any of these uniforms for one another. The first is Hessian. The second is American. The third is Hessian, and you might have recognized him from earlier, but the fourth is American. And even with their heads on, their similarity is amazing. These were not red coats who were wearing a bright red lobster colored jacket. The Hessian and the American uniforms were virtually identical. And most of the locals would not have seen a lot of Hessian soldiers. This was the first major battle of the war that actually came through White Plains, so they were not accustomed to seeing these Hessians, at least not yet. They would become accustomed to them as the British occupied the area, but at this point, it was virtually they were virtually strangers to them. So if they saw someone lying on the battlefield and they had no head, they still would have tried to treat them with the dignity of the dead and collected the bodies. And so may easily have actually collected the body of this headless Hessian and put him in with the American dead. At least I think that that is a pretty compelling and likely outcome. It's one of the best reasons I can imagine why they would have collected this soldier and actually brought him to the more accessible Sleepy Hollow churchyard, which, by the way, remains one of the oldest standing churches in America. The Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow has been there since the 1680s. So, in fact, the body of the trooper was most likely buried there at the churchyard in Sleepy Hollow. And if, in fact, he does ride forth every night to the scene of battle, he doesn't have a terribly long ride. Now,
That
if
is
you
fascinating. Chris, this is a fascinating tale.
I'm very glad that you are enjoying it, and to me, it was such great joy to research this and to learn about this soldier and be able to identify him for the first time. But interestingly enough, if you find yourself in Sleepy Hollow, and I highly recommend any of you to go, it's a charming little town, and you can go to this wonderful church, again, one of the oldest standing churches in the nation. And if you go there, however, what you will not find is a grave for the Headless Hessian. They have, over the course of the years, occasionally put a little marker up, and it was mostly fanciful. All it ever said was Hessian soldier on it, because they did not have a name. And even the dates on it were often random because people didn't know specifically when he died. The information from General Heath's notebook was not known until a few years ago. And so the actual identity of the soldier is a fairly new discovery. But I like to hold out hope that we will get a grave for the Hessian at last. Sacred to the memory of Heinrich Range, Grenadier Regiment von Rahl, who would have been born in 1752. So he was only 24 years old, died in November 1st, excuse me, of 1776. And so I do like to hold out that we will eventually get a grave for the Hessian in there, and to be able to honor not only the life of this young man who died here on our soil, but also honoring the legend that he is connected to. So that is something that I do like to hope one day we will see. And I think there is actually some valid hope for it, because it's worth noting that a few years ago, I believe it was in 2019, the Old Dutch Church erected a gravestone for another character from a folk tale there. There's a wonderful story about a woman by the name of Hulda, and she's often referred to simply as Hulda the Bohemian. She was a woman that came from, I believe that's near the Croatian border, where the modern day Bohemia is, but who came to Sleepy Hollow around 1777. This was during the heart of the American Revolution, by the way, but she was regarded by the locals as a witch. And sometimes people would go to her for herbs and simples, but for the most part, she was shunned by the town, because this was a time when people still believed in witchcraft. The witchcraft hysteria was long behind us, but people still had a lot of distrust and a lot of superstition. So Hulda mostly ostracized by the town, but the town at that time, in the heart of the American Revolution, was constantly under siege, because it was in the sort of no man's land between the American line and the British line. So Sleepy Hollow was frequently raided. And during one of these raids, who should show up to help defend the town but Hulda? She came basically dressed like a man, as she did every day. She was someone who lived largely in a hut that was just outside of town. She lived off the land, so she was a tough broad. She arrived there with her rifle, and she sat behind a wall with, excuse me, sip here. So she lined up behind this stone wall with the rest of the men of Sleepy Hollow, and she fired on the British until she drove them off. And she actually helped save the town that day. However, during the course of the battle, Hulda was shot, and that wound ended up becoming fatal. When she died, the people of the town finally realized that they had misjudged her. And so they actually did bury her in the graveyard. And this is something that is recorded in all the town folklore, but not recorded in any official burials of the church. She did not have a headstone, possibly a little bit of a leftover from their suspicions about her being a witch. And it wasn't until 2019 or possibly 2020 that the church finally decided, and the Friends of the Old Dutch Church sponsored this, to give Hulda the Bohemian, this herbalist, healer, and patriot, her own stone. So I believe that if Hulda, the Witch of Sleepy Hollow, gets a stone, that certainly I would think that Heinrich the Headless Horseman deserves one as well. So I will hold out hope that we will eventually get a stone for the Headless Hessian. Now, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, as we said from the beginning, is really one of the most iconic stories in American history. It is the first great American ghost story, and has been adapted countless times on stage, in plays, and of course in film. I first learned of it when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, from the Disney cartoon, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is wonderful. If you haven't seen it, it's one of the most charming versions ever, and it's actually quite faithful to the original story. It was made in 1949. I think most people know the 1999 film by Tim Burton, which is a wonderful gothic horror story. It's certainly a little on the grim side and gruesome side. If you're not into the horror thing, you want to be cautious, because it does not stint on the bloody scenes. However, it's also very charming. It's beautifully made, and it does wildly diverge from the original story. Takes the core of Washington Irving's story, and it throws in witchcraft and murders and all sorts of things, but it's still a delightful film. So if you're looking for a Halloween movie that has a real sense of style to it, and maybe a wee bit of gore, I would certainly highly recommend it. And for those of you who haven't seen it, because it wasn't terribly popular, there was even a television series that ran from, I believe, 2013 or 2014, ran for 4 seasons, called Sleepy Hollow on the Fox network. And that was absolutely bonkers, but I loved it, because in this version, Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman. Ichabod Crane in this version was a British soldier who ends up encountering the Headless Horseman in Sleepy Hollow during a battle, and they are both killed in this exchange. And 200 years later, a witch summons them back, and they awaken in Sleepy Hollow, and it becomes kind of an X-Files series with the Headless Horseman as the sort of the leader of the evil factions, and Ichabod Crane, this soldier out of time, becoming part of a duo. Him and one of the local cops end up solving supernatural crimes. It's bonkers. It's delightful. The first two seasons are by far the best, and so highly recommended if you have a taste for that sort of thing and you'd like to see one of the most fascinating reinventions of Legend of Sleepy Hollow ever made. But 200 years later, I always ask, does the Hessian still haunt the wooded byways of Sleepy Hollow and the Hudson Valley? Does the horseman's restless spirit still ride out in eternal search for his skull? Perhaps the only way to know is to see for yourself, but if you should visit that haunted valley, I'd like you to heed my sage advice. Don't lose your head. So, folks, I want to thank you very much for coming along or coming out tonight and listening to this. If you do have any interest in my work, you've got some to choose from. My website is ghostboypress.com, and you can pick up The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You can pick up Ghosts of New England, which has stories from all over the region, all based on real folklore and real stories. And my most recent publication, Hunting Dracula, which covers not only the origins of the historic Dracula known as Vlad the Impaler from Romanian history, but how Bram Stoker came to write the novel and how it came to be inspired. So if anybody is interested in picking up any of these, you can visit my website, and every copy that goes out is signed by me. So so please feel free to give that a shot and check that out. So
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I learned a great deal from it. And we have some nice comments here. Diane says, fascinating research and story. And Maritza says, incredible story. I visited it years ago as a highly commercialized event. Lots of fun.
it
That
is
was
great fun to go to
really
Sleepy
good.
Hollow. It's one of my favorite things to do every year.
Well, I love Halloween and I love all Halloween stories and scary stuff. So does anyone have any questions? You guys can unmute yourself and ask a question of Chris.
Yeah, I'm happy to ask questions about any of these subjects.
We do have the book, the Sleepy Hollow book that Chris wrote in the library. Someone has it checked out at the moment, I noticed today. So
That's a good sign.
if you would like to read it, you can come to the reference desk. I'll put a reserve in for you. So what do we say? Any questions? Is everyone just too stunned into silence? I don't know.
Well, I hope that's a good sign. I know it didn't bore you all you folks to sleep with that one.
That's right. I believe he is still haunting the graveyard.
I
really
like
do.
to think that he's out there and that maybe someday he'll be reunited with his head and get a measure of peace.
That's right. Well, it was really, you've done so much incredible research. Great job. And thank you very much for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you. It was a labor of love, and hopefully you'll have me back next year around Halloween time when I'll be
Yes.
hopefully talking about local or werewolf tales from all over the world. That's my next big project. So
Oh, good. Or maybe the Dracula book too. Well, if no one has any questions, I guess I will just say thanks again. And thank you all for being here. And I guess I'll see you next time. So
wonderful.
good night, everyone. And a
Thank you
happy
very much,
belated
folks, for coming.
Halloween. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Okay.
Good night, folks. Thank you.
Good night.